start now. It's now 7 o'clock. My name is Ted Gest. I'm a board member of the Chevy Chase Citizens Association, and we are glad tonight to be co-sponsoring a program with Historic Chevy Chase DC. Both groups, I'm going to turn this over in a second to Carl Lankowski of Historic Chevy Chase DC. Both of our groups have been having Zoom sessions during the pandemic on topics of interest to our community. So we are glad that everyone has joined us tonight for this joint program. And as I understand it, this is part of a series that the Historic Chevy Chase DC is doing called Race Matters Locally. And we at Chevy Chase DC have been holding programs with some of our elected officials. We had one with Representative Eleanor Holmes Norton, and we had one with DC Council Member Mary Che, and we will be planning others in the near future. So what we're going to do tonight, I'm going to turn it over to Carl to make a couple of opening comments and to introduce our speaker. And after she speaks, we will ask questions that any of you can submit by using the chat function at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to remind you of that later, but submit your questions anytime through the chat function, and we will try to answer them. We're trying to have this program in 1 hour. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carl Lankowski. Carl?
Thanks, Ted. I really appreciate it. And first of all, it's a pleasure to partner with the Chevy Chase Citizens Association. It's always been doing great work, not only in this field, but in many others. So it's nice to be working together on this particular evening, and especially on this particular subject, a subject which should be of particular interest at the opening of a new administration that will, I'm sure, be examining in greater detail with some significant policy innovation in the housing area that we're going to be discussing tonight. It's not the first time that we have connected with Prologue LLC, although we haven't worked specifically with Sarah Shoenfeld. And so I wanted to say hello, Sarah. Thanks for doing this with us tonight. It's a pleasure to meet you finally after working with your partner, Mara Tchaikovsky, for so many months now on a project that is connected to what you'll be speaking about tonight. The issue that you'll be addressing, of course, is much greater than restrictive covenants, but we, Historic Chevy Chase DC, in our mission to examine our own community, the streetscape, how it's developed, and the social aspects of the streetscape that we live in, is connected to this issue of restrictive covenants. And we've been working with Prologue on its mapping segregation project to uncover where those restrictive covenants are, and they're pretty general around the neighborhood. As Sarah will be saying, I think, much more about that lately, but let me, or in due course. I have just finished a close reading of a very important reading for all of us in this area. It's called The Color of Law. It's by Richard Rothstein, who is associated with the Economic Policy Institute, among other places. And in that book, a recent book, I think it was published in 2017, he makes the point, let me look down at my notes here and actually quote, "Only if we can develop a broadly shared understanding of our common history will it be possible and practical to consider the steps we can take to fulfill our obligations as citizens to overcome the problems of segregation that we have." And we know that housing is the root of so many other issues involving the segregation that we're trying to overcome in some way or another. So I want to thank particularly Sarah Schoenfeld for joining us tonight, for taking the time out of her busy schedule to present. She'll be doing that over the next 35 minutes, and we'll have a chance for Q&A after that. Rather than go into detail about the many things that Prologue does, which are many and very useful, let me just turn things over to her right now and step out of the way. Thank you, Sarah.
Great, thank you, Carl. Okay, so yeah, I'm not going to, I'll just say I co-direct the project Mapping Segregation with Washington, D.C., Mapping Segregation in Washington, D.C. with my colleague Mara Cherkasky, and we have a company called Prologue DC. We do other kinds of work, but more and more of our work seems to be around the intersection of race and housing in DC. So I'm just going to go ahead and start share my screen and get started. Are we good? Can you all see my screen? Yep, great. Yep. Okay, so we started this work in 2014 with the goal of mapping the historic use of racially restrictive deed covenants in DC, and have since expanded our mission to look at other mechanisms of segregation and displacement and how all these things have impacted the city over time. So just briefly, racial deed covenants barred the conveyance of property to people of African descent and often to other groups. And this was a very significant way that cities were shaped in response to the Great Migration, which involved the movement of around 6 million Black people from the South to cities across the North from about, between about 1890 and 1960. Covenants were not widely used before this time, nor were they commonly used in the South. The covenants laid the foundation for what's commonly known as redlining. But to clarify, redlining refers to the practice of discriminatory lending. Racial deed covenants, though, they emerged around the turn of the 20th century and helped shape the segregated landscape and the association of race with the value of property that the practice of redlining then reinforced. And covenants remained legally enforceable until 1948, and they remained legal to use until 1968. And the slide that you're seeing is DC's Petworth neighborhood when it was first developed. This is a picture of it in the 1920s as a white subdivision. Many of the developers here inserted racial covenants into the deeds when the houses were first built. So far, we've mostly focused on documenting covenants in the part of the city where Petworth is. So this is the Petworth area and sort of north of here in Ward 4, east of Rock Creek Park. But certainly covenants were used in many other neighborhoods, mostly in areas further from downtown that began to be built up in the early decades of the 20th century. And they were definitely used west of Rock Creek Park, as you can see. And we've just mapped, a small number of them thus far. And they were used east of the Anacostia River. So neighborhoods such as Randall Highlands and Congress Heights, these were developed as white subdivisions. This is an early example of a racially restrictive deed covenant. This one's handwritten because it's from 1902. It was written by a development company called Middaugh and Shannon. Which for one of the new houses they built in DC's then newly subdivided Bloomingdale neighborhood. And so you can see that it reads here in the highlighted portion that said lot shall never be rented, leased, sold, transferred, or conveyed unto any Negro or colored person under a penalty of $2,000. And so Middaugh and Shannon was the precursor to Shannon and Lux, which many of you may be familiar with if you're longtime residents of DC. I certainly remember, I grew up in Chevy Chase, and I remember a lot of Shannon and Lux signs around, certainly like in the 70s and 80s. So Shannon Lux was among the major developers of Ward 4, east of Rock Creek Park, where we've mapped deed covenants along with the developers who use them when they first built and sold the houses in the neighborhoods here, Petworth, Brightwood, Shepherd Park area, Tacoma. So another major developer here was Morris Kafritz, who developed the lots you see in blue. I don't know if you're seeing my name over the screen. There we go. And of course, the Kafritz family remains quite active in real estate today and through its foundation, the Morris and Gwendolyn Kafritz Foundation. And this is thanks largely to wealth accumulated via the sale of property that was restricted to whites only. And then we go west of the park. You've got a company also still active today, WC&A and Miller. They're among the best known of the developers that used racial covenants, in part because they used them for at least a decade after the Supreme Court ruled them legally unenforceable. So this deed is actually from 10 years after that, from 1958. And it also bars, in addition to African Americans from purchasing property in the area they developed, it bars any person of the Semitic race, blood, or origin. These include Armenians, Jews, Hebrews, Persians, and Syrians, except for people that may be employed as domestic servants. And so WC&A and Miller developed much of the Spring Valley neighborhood around American University. We've mapped only a small portion of those lots thus far. Oh, and I wanted to mention too that we learned from an oral history interview that this company was also quite active in sort of persuading white homeowners east of the park to sell their houses and move to the suburbs when you get into the early 1960s. Oh, and then I also wanted to mention on this map that here we've got Fort Reno, which many of you may know by now. There was a very significant Black community there, and we've mapped some covenants close to that area. And I just wanted to point that out because covenants were often used in areas close to where Black Washingtonians already lived or had lived until they were made to move. So in earlier decades, before planned subdivisions like Chevy Chase and Petworth were built north of Florida Avenue, which was the city's original boundary, or east of the Anacostia River, it was more common for Black and white people to live in closer physical proximity. So for example, at Reno, we know from oral histories that it was said that white and Black families sort of lived in like a checkerboard pattern. And then in downtown, in neighborhoods such as Shaw, that's shown here on the map, and Capitol Hill, that's shown in the photograph, it was common for Black and white households to actually share the same lots, with Black residents often living in the alley-facing housing, although not always, sometimes in the street-facing housing, and then more often whites living in the street-facing houses. So Blagden Alley would have been down here, and then the other picture from Capitol Hill would have been much further south. But this is showing this area of the city because but prior to around the turn of the 20th century, much of the area north of Florida Avenue was largely rural. But as the streetcar lines, which you see in the colored lines, developed, extended beyond Florida Avenue, you get these new subdivisions being developed. Which become segregated white enclaves through the use of these of covenants. And this is one of them. This is Bloomingdale, which is just north of Florida Avenue, which is developed as an exclusively white community, immediately north of an area where a lot of Black people already lived, like Shaw, Truxton Circle area, just south of Florida Avenue. Also adjacent to LaDroit Park, where African Americans had begun settling, relatively well-to-do Black neighborhood beginning in the 1890s. And then north of here, you've got Howard University. So Bloomingdale, at the time that it began developing, is already surrounded on three sides by neighborhoods where Black people already lived. And this is what some of its housing looked like, just off of North Capitol Street on the west side of North Capitol along Rhode Island, quite substantial Victorian style row houses. And then a bit north of here, this is a neighborhood also quite close to Howard University, another white subdivision, Parkview. I'm showing these not, this doesn't maybe look much like Chevy Chase, although there might be parts of it that do, but I just think it's important to convey that these residentially dense neighborhoods that were filled with row houses were also racially exclusive. So the housing stock is not indicative of the neighborhoods being like more inclusive or diverse in today's language. And in fact, these neighborhoods these neighborhoods that were east of Rock Creek Park were actually more likely to be filled with racial covenants, we think, because they were, relatively accessible and desirable to Black households. And I just think this is something to consider sort of in light of the current conversations around building more housing and increasing density as a solution to racial inequity in housing. So covenants created barriers around areas where Black people already lived. So this is that Bloomingdale neighborhood that I just talked about. This is Columbia Heights over here. This is Petworth up here, Parkview. Then you've got Mount Pleasant over here. And then the courts also enforce these barriers by upholding covenants. So especially in Bloomingdale, Bloomingdale became a national epicenter of legal challenges to racial covenants. And over the course of about 3 decades, the courts generally upheld covenants along this, upheld this racial barrier at First Street. And then here again is a map showing the whole city with its racial makeup in 1940. This represents all of our research thus far in the use of covenants in DC. And I just wanted to show this map to distinguish the two types of covenants. So the blue represent lots that were restricted by developers when the housing was first built. And then the red represent lots that were later restricted by white residents, so organized by citizens associations who distributed petitions that once signed by the neighbors and submitted to the recorder of deeds became legally binding covenants, but a different mechanism. And these kind of covenants were much more common in other places. In fact, I think in Chicago, this is the primary type of covenant that was used. And as I mentioned, so we haven't actually, that we haven't done a lot of research west of Rock Creek Park, but it's quite possible that covenants were not used as heavily in that part of the city because, because there are other reasons that Black people were less likely to settle west of the park. For one, there was this somewhat intentional barrier created by the park itself. Senator Francis Newlands, who owned the Chevy Chase Land Company, was also quite active in the establishment of Rock Creek Park. And then secondly, much of the section of the city west of the park was developed to be more expensive. So the lots were larger, most of the housing was detached. And this was largely put in place by other types of covenants that required, for example, houses to cost a certain amount to build. So there were a variety of covenants that were placed into deeds that served as sort of an early form of residential zoning before, zoning, city zoning came into play. But then once it did in the 1920s, zoning regulations sort of like, they essentially baked into place the patterns that had been created by covenants. At least they did so west of the park.
Sarah, there's a question coming in about what the tan shading represents.
Oh, sorry. I guess this wasn't clear in my legend. I have a legend here, but I don't know how readable it is to you all. So this is the racial makeup of the city block by block that we've mapped using census data. So the darker blocks are, the darkest blocks are ones that would be 80 to 100% Black occupied. And then the lightest colored blocks would be, you know, almost entirely white occupied. So that's what the shading represents. And just like for a little more background on how this all came to be, these mechanisms for residential segregation came into use during a period when the field of real estate was being professionalized and was embracing this emerging science around property appraisal that said the presence of people who weren't white decreased the value of property. So this is a 1923 real estate textbook, you know, advising that for this reason, the two groups should live in geographically separate areas. And I like to include this because, you know, this textbook's like not an outlier. And I think it's important to understand that racial segregation wasn't something that just naturally happened because people were more racist back then. In fact, like a lot of white people, even at the time, you know, were pretty adamant that they had nothing against, quote, the colored people or Negroes, but they were simply trying to protect the value of their house. And that having Black people around, or Black schools or churches or playgrounds that would attract Black people to the areas they lived would devalue their property. And then because racial covenants then confined so many African Americans to living in older, less desirable, and often overcrowded housing in areas that lacked investment in like even basic municipal infrastructure in some cases, and areas that were heavily policed, then Blackness becomes associated with slums and blight and criminality. So hence you get the conflation of Black people with the devaluation of property during this period. So in keeping with this, the Washington Real Estate Board required its members to uphold segregation. And this was also the policy of the National Association of Realtors. And so just jumping forward, I think that this explicit linkage that was made between race and the value of property is key to understanding where we are now. You know, values continue to be higher in areas where fewer Black people live. And this isn't just to do with housing stock or location. And I think this helps explain why the process of gentrification, which generates wealth and increases the value of property in previously disinvested areas, typically involves the displacement of Black people. Certainly here in DC, that's the case. And I think, you know, across the US, that's fairly typical. So again, it's via covenants and then associated real estate policies that we end up with large swaths of the city being restricted to whites only, and including areas where African Americans had previously lived. Okay, so this includes this area, this subdivision of Chevy Chase Grove. My project partner, Mara Cherkasky, has recently identified, in part because we're hoping that members of historic Chevy Chase are going to help with this covenant research, all of the squares just in doing some spot checking, where we know that there were racial covenants used in this area. So those are all the ones that are outlined here with the red rectangles. There was a black settlement here, which you all probably know this by now too, if you've attended any of these other talks or been engaged in the process in the neighborhood around the renaming of the recreation, or the naming of the new recreation center at Lafayette. There was an extended Black family that occupied that land until 1928, when they were forced to leave for the development of Lafayette Elementary School and the rec center and the park there for what was an emerging white neighborhood. And these are just a couple of examples that Mara pulled of the covenants used in Chevy Chase Grove, 1926, and in Forest Hills in 1941. It developed a bit later. And I wanted to include this advertisement for Chevy Chase Grove, which calls it a suburb of restrictions and detached homes. And it also seems to conflate home ownership with citizenship, which I found interesting, because I know that the membership of citizens associations was restricted to property owners. I don't know if that's still the case. Citizens associations also barred Black members, and these groups that were restricted to white property owners were had a fairly significant role in the governance of the city for a long time, due to the fact that we didn't have home rule, and we had no self-elected government until 1974. So you've got sort of the most, the citizens associations are the ones that sort of have the net, are able to network with the people in Congress that are running the city, on the district, the House, and the commissioners that are running in the city. So they have a fairly, and I would say they probably weren't acting in the interest of Black residents. In fact, part of their role was to keep their neighborhoods segregated. So on the federal level, residential segregation was institutionalized by the Federal Housing Administration, which used covenants as a criterion for mortgage lending. And this map shows where the FHA underwrote mortgages just during the first 2 years of its existence in the DC area. We don't have good racial data for the suburbs, but we know by the fact that the FHA financed mortgages in these areas that they were developed to be exclusively white suburbs. And this was probably the most significant tool that the federal government used to concentrate wealth in white communities. The FHA also made maps for DC and many other cities that used, that incorporated racial criteria in grading various sections of the city based on their the likely future value of those sections. So we color coded the map for the DC area, and then combined it with the census data that we had collected for 1940. So all of these, the gray circles represent Black households. So you can see the vast majority of them are living in the lowest graded areas, if you can see the legend here. So almost no banks would provide mortgages or home improvement loans to people in the red areas, or to any Black person, regardless of where they wanted to live. And this, of course, was a common pattern in other cities as well. So it leads to the vast majority of Black Americans essentially being barred from participating in the real estate market all the way until 1968, when the Fair Housing Act was passed. By which time then many lacked the wealth to buy property, and still, of course, face very significant barriers to home buying and real estate investment. and because property ownership has been the primary means for accumulating wealth in the United States, I would say that today's vast racial wealth gap can be directly traced to these policies. And so I just wanted to display this table, which shows that even the most highly educated Black households have less wealth than white households who lack college diplomas, and then far less than whites with college or graduate degrees. And then the other thing that these policies did was they displaced longstanding Black communities that had owned land on the outskirts of DC. So I mentioned the family, the extended family that had occupied the site where Lafayette School was. They had been there for generations. There's other communities that show up on this map that was made in 1934. This is the Reno community here. This is a community along Chain Bridge Road called, I think, St. Philip's Hill. This is around Fort Stevens and Brightwood. And then there's some other communities, you know, that are all getting all these little communities are then getting pushed in to the city as these areas develop. And my next slide also shows the little schools that were serving African-American communities on the outskirts of the city. All of these ones that I've marked with the stars were closed by the mid-1920s. In Reno, the Black school remained open, but almost all of the Black residents of the area were forced to move away in the 20s and 30s. So there were around 370 families that lived there. Most of them were African-American, but as I mentioned earlier, there white families lived there as well, and it was fairly, I think the settlement pattern was fairly integrated. I can't speak for the community interactions. There's a really great video that was done that was shown at the DC History Conference recently. I think it was produced and definitely narrated by Wilson High School students. It's full of old photographs of the houses that were, that were at Reno, and some of them still there even once Deal and Wilson got built. So anyway, I recommend it, and I can put a link if somebody reminds me after. I can put a link in the chat because I can't figure out how to do that right now, but I have it here in my notes, and I would definitely recommend you all watch it. It's really good. And then nearby in Bethesda, Maryland, just up River Road, sort of just across the DC line, a community was also forced out in the 1950s from an area where they had lived for a very long time. And there's still ongoing efforts to save or to at least commemorate a cemetery in that area. So the man here on the right in the suit, his family lived on this land. They had a farm where that Whole Foods is now, until they moved into DC in the early 60s. I think they were maybe the last family that moved into DC as this area was being developed for white settlement. So in addition to people being pushed in from nearby Maryland and Virginia, then an enormous number of migrants were coming from further south, mainly Virginia and North Carolina, and especially beginning in the 1940s. So by 1957, DC became the first significant majority Black city in the country. So again, this is DC in 1940 with covenants still in force. Then you have the black population triples over the next 3 decades. The white population actually declines by 50% by 1970, and the city looks like that 30 years later. So you can see, like, even as Black Washingtonians claimed an enormous amount of space that had previously been off limits to them, they were mostly confined to living east of Rock Creek Park. And while zoning did serve to sort of bake in place the single family housing landscape that characterized around 80% of the land west of the park here, the area east of the Anacostia River was upzoned in 1960 so that it could be filled with apartments. And this was to accommodate the thousands of people displaced from Southwest DC and other parts of the city for urban renewal and for highway building and the expansion of roads within the city, roads like Rhode Island Avenue, New York Avenue, North Capitol, you know, with the underpasses that get built, and the landscape looked very different before around 1960. And so a lot of people were getting displaced, and a large percentage of them move east of the Anacostia River. So again, so this area east of the river gets rezoned or upzoned around 1960, allowing for much denser development, despite the fact that it's quite isolated from the rest of the city, lacks good access to downtown jobs, transit, some basic amenities that are still lacking. But you get around 75% of the land there zoned for apartment construction. And so this is looking at, the red are all areas of apartments east of the Anacostia River and west of Rock Creek Park. And I think that's where I'm going to stop. We have our website is chock full of our project, I feel like, is like sort of like a hyper local version of Richard Rothstein's book, and
Yes.
It's interactive. And so there's a lot to explore here at mappingsegregation.org. I also, we have some articles if you prefer just to read at DC Policy Center. If you just go to dcpolicycenter.org and would put in my name, you'll be able to bring these up. And I would especially recommend this one, Race and Real Estate in Mid-Century DC, because it talks about some of the stuff that I haven't gotten to about sort of how the real estate community facilitated white flight and the role and the resistance to discriminatory real estate practices, especially by people sort of around the Shepherd Park and Brightwood, those neighborhoods around there. And I think I have one more slide here about volunteering, which maybe Carl can talk about. Oh no, that's about Chevy Chase. Because we are working to try to document covenants around Chevy Chase, and it's fairly simple. It's fairly simple for people to participate in the project, to enter the data from the comfort of your home. So we definitely would invite people to volunteer.
Okay, thank you, Sarah, for your good presentation. I'm Ted Gest from the Chevy Chase Citizens Association. For those of you who came in during the program, I wanted to clarify, just because of a technical glitch, Carl Lankowski is using my link, so my name appears under Carl. I'm the one here with the painting on the wall. So I just wanted to clarify that. I think we have some questions in the chat function. If any, we have, I think, about 15 or 20 minutes left for questions for Sarah. Carl, do you want to start the question period?
Yeah, thanks. First of all, Ted, let me just take up what Sarah has gotten to in the last part of her discussion. The part of the mission of Historic Chevy Chase DC is not only to take Rothstein's challenge seriously to learn more about what was happening, but to become active learners in what has happened to our neighborhood over the course of the last 100 years or so. And it's with that in mind that we were delighted to team up with Prologue and Sarah and Mara to involve, our neighbors in this process of doing research on restrictive covenants. And as she said, it's not all that challenging. It takes a few hours of your time to get through one of these property squares, but it's enormously rewarding as a facet of connecting with the place that you live. Just reading through some of those things are just a fascinating exercise. So I wanted to make a plug for that. And you can get in touch with me or Sarah or Mara for that matter for further details about how to become engaged. Some of the questions had to do with how this is all related to Chevy Chase. And I was wondering whether, Sarah, you wanted to say more about the applicability of some of this to our own neighborhood.
I mean, I try to sort of address, I mean, I feel like it's applicable in this, like in looking at your neighborhood in relationship to the whole city, and like why it's there is incredible wealth disparity and racial disparity, and I hope that those maps display that. Though it doesn't look that much different now than it did on those the latest map I guess I showed was 1970, but I do have ones that are more recent available that I could show. So I think I feel like it's important to understand the development of Chevy Chase in the context of like how the whole city developed and why it looks actually pretty different from a lot of the city. I wasn't actually that aware of that myself growing up in Chevy Chase. I was surrounded by a lot of neighborhoods that look kind of like mine, and I didn't even cross the park that much. Yeah, I mean, Chevy Chase is a neighborhood that benefited from the kind of investment that was made into developing, neighborhoods that were racially exclusive. And I don't know if you have any specific questions.
Yeah, I mean,
about it, I can.
One of the issues that comes up also in Rothstein's book, which is kind of the Bible for this sort of inquiry these days, starting with the hypothesis that the segregation that we see did not happen naturally, that it was created. And it was created with the complicity of the government on all levels. So that what we like to think of as de facto segregation was never de facto. It was actually produced by government action. And some of the facets of segregation that you mentioned, like the restrictive covenants, in fact, what they did, as you mentioned, they forced people into the neighborhoods in what became the inner city, right east of the park, and what that did is it among other things unleashed a economic dynamic that was perverse. The rents that were charged to people that were looking for housing suddenly increased a lot because there were so many people that couldn't find accommodation elsewhere because of the restrictions that you talked about. And so they ended up paying more, and that led in turn, right, to not being able to afford mortgages when the restrictions were then limited after 1948. So what we have here is a kind of cumulative historical effect after the Supreme Court announced the unenforceability of restrictive covenants in 1948. So that even with the FHA and the legislation in 1968 that was created to try to overcome some of this, you had this legacy of the past that is still with us. So the question that is being asked by some of the people viewing tonight is, how do we get affordability? What sort of policies can we adopt that would actually help overcome this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure what the answer to that is, because I think what I don't even know that it's like the right question exactly. Like, do we need to make does the focus need to be on making it possible for more lower income or non-white people to live in Chevy Chase? Or could we invest in the areas where those people already live? It's not that people necessarily want to move there. And in fact, there were there were efforts to get people to move, to get Black people specifically to move to Chevy Chase in the 1960s that weren't that successful.
Yeah, I noticed you had a slide that you ended on that.
I did. I put it in there, and I can share it back. It's kind of
that really caught my attention when I saw the slides. Just
yeah, I wasn't sure if I was going to show that slide, but I will.
Yeah. But as you find it, let me just say that the some research has been done that would indicate that there are real benefits to living in an integrated neighborhood. So I take your point that there's a question of where people actually want to live and where they feel comfortable for historical reasons on both sides, right? Both people of color and whites. But the question still remains, how are people's life chances going to be improved?
Well, okay. Yeah, I mean, so the thing is, though, the reason that integration is beneficial is because opportunity and capital and good schools and good housing tends to go where white people are, and everybody wants those things. So I guess I feel like the focus might be less on integration per se, and like focusing on giving everybody those opportunities, and giving like, how can we provide good schools to everybody and good health care, and the opportunities that people seek, people who and I'm talking about specifically not white people or lower income people, lower wealth people, or that are seek in integrated neighborhoods, or integrated schools, and certainly those were the fundamental things that the people that were fought so hard to desegregate our schools. They weren't fighting because they wanted to go to school with white people. They were fighting because they knew those were that there was never going to be such thing as a separate but equal school, racially separate but equal schools. So yeah, but I do think, I think integration is a benefit to white people, certainly, too. So I do think it's for sure worth thinking about, like how to how to provide a way for anybody who wants to, I guess, to live to live west of the park, but it's but I'm just not, but I don't know, like, I don't know what the solution is, because I don't think it's, I think the primary solution that's been talked about is sort of building more housing and building affordable housing, but mostly affordable housing is not actually that affordable. based on the formulas that are used, that define what affordable means.
Could I, I'd like to make one comment and ask a question. One comment, I think, Sarah, a few minutes ago, you said you didn't know whether neighborhood associations currently had discriminatory clauses. I can't speak for all of them. I know that our own association, which goes back to 1909, did have discriminatory elements. And I think Carl has done some research on this, but this has not been true for the 20 years that I've been associated with it. In fact, we welcome people from all ethnicities, and I'm pretty sure that would be true of most or all neighborhood associations of the district. I just wanted to make that clear.
Yeah.
I think we, but changing the topic, I think we indicated that if you have some knowledge of the proposed comprehensive plan that is being considered by district officials right now, and again, this is a proposal, it hasn't been adopted, but it among other things, I believe that the proposal would call for a higher density of housing in the Chevy Chase neighborhood, and I'm sure some other neighborhoods. Do you have any views, and it might be very general at this point, about how this comprehensive plan would affect what we've been talking about, the desegregation of housing in the city?
I don't think that I think the idea that's been presented is that somehow that building more housing will have a desegregating effect. But there has been no evidence of that so far. We've been building a lot of housing. And then the thing is that the way that we build housing, and even when we're talking affordable housing, even building affordable housing is dependent on building a whole lot more market rate housing. I mean, that's how we get it. It's like developers agree to build a certain percentage of units that are affordable to people that make X percentage of like the area median income. But it's fairly small percentage per development. So, and then when you have a very large amount of market rate housing being built, I mean, thus far it's resulted in the city just becoming more expensive to live in, and then people being displaced to neighborhoods. So we've to neighborhoods that are less, haven't gentrified yet. And so we have, poverty and segregation have increased east of the Anacostia River. I'm not sure. I mean, what also concerns me about the comprehensive plan is what's built into it is sort of a lot of, the ability for ANCs and citizens of DC to actually influence, what is developed in their communities. And there's been real pushback, I think, by people. There's been some lawsuits that the courts have actually agreed in some cases that some developments are exacerbating displacement or gentrification, and have actually held those up or required that the developers take out some of the density, the new language that's going into the comp plan is kind of the city's response to that, and like sort of wanting this stuff to be moved forward more quickly. So where there's language that in the current comp plan that is somewhat restrictive, the new language is sort of advisory. So and interestingly, because I did participate in the process of advocating around one of the framework element of the comp plan, and like all of these many people across the city submit proposed amendments, and in looking at those, the bulk of then the amendments that were actually drafted into the plan by the city's Office of Planning were amendments that were offered by real estate developers or attorneys for real estate developers. So it's hard to think that that those amendments are going to be beneficial to the city as a whole. I think building a lot more housing is going to primarily benefit the real estate community, and not necessarily lead to the outcomes that that have been stated. Like building a more equitable, inclusive city.
Okay, I'm going to try to get to a couple of the questions that people have submitted on the chat function. A couple of people have asked about Rock Creek Park. You made a brief reference to this. Well, I'll just read one of the questions here. What one of our viewers tonight said, you made a brief reference to the Chevy Chase Land Company's role in causing Rock Creek Park to be designated as a park, intimating that this was seen as a way of perpetuating segregation. And this viewer tonight said, are you meaning to suggest that had it not been designated as a park, it too would have been bought up and developed in a segregated fashion?
I don't know about that, but I know, and I don't know, I'm not an expert on Rock Creek Park by any means, but I do know that Francis Newlands, who owned the Chevy Chase Land Company, was also very active in promoting the establishment of the national park. And, it was an area where people actually lived. And it was, and I think part of it was that it took a lot, because it was, expanded, it took a lot of land out of the market. So I think it made then the land in Chevy Chase actually more valuable by sort of taking all of this other land that could have been developed, designating that as national park. And I understand that it was seen by Newlands, at least, as a barrier, yes, as a barrier to Black movement to the west. There weren't that many ways to get across it, and it wasn't. And then, of course, all the neighborhoods west of the park were developed as exclusive neighborhoods. I can't say what would have happened had it not been built, had it not been established as a park.
Another question, we aren't going to have time to get to all the questions, unfortunately, but you identified a couple of specific real estate firms that were involved with these racial covenants, and one of our viewers has asked whether you are researching which banks or mortgage finance companies were most heavily involved with this. Were you meaning to suggest that those were the main guilty parties, so to speak, or is this?
No, we have researched a lot of our work focused on this one section of the city where there were grants available, honestly, to do this work. So that Ward 4 east of Rock Creek Park area. So it's there that we decided to hone in on who the major developers were, and look at the intersection of those developers with the placement of racial covenants. So certainly those developers were active all over the city. And we know if they use covenants, and Harry Wardman was another one, a builder who, very prominent builder in the city. We know if we use covenants in Bloomingdale or in Petworth or, Trightwood, it's likely that they use them elsewhere. And we know that they are prominent developers, but I don't mean to say, I can't say whether they're the worst culprits.
Okay, I wanted to mention one thing, and then I'll turn it back over to Carl if he has any closing comments, because I think we've got to quit pretty soon. But I wanted to mention, for those of you who don't know about it, our local advisory neighborhood commission, it was called 4G because we're in wards 3 and 4, has a task force on racism that has a housing group report, and so that is out. There's a link to it in the chat function, but I wanted to mention there's a lot more current information about some of this that this task force is working on as we speak. So Carl, do you want to ask anything else or make any closing comments here?
Just thank you, Ted. Just in the spirit of a closing comment more than anything else, to thank Sarah for a wonderful presentation, depressing, but wonderful presentation that brings us a lot more information about how we got to where we are, and helps us better understand the challenges we have going forward, given the dynamics that we've seen develop over the past 40, 50, 60 years. So it's a first step. We need to know a lot more. Sarah and Mara are doing wonderful work in carrying this out. We ought to support them where we can. HCDC is trying to do that. Chevy Chase Citizens Association has taken this on board as well. And I see that Ed Hayes is with us tonight as well. And I wanted to give a shout out to Ed while he's here, because the Citizens Association certainly did change, from the bad old days in the 1950s to the period by the end of the 1970s, where a complete change of heart had taken place in that Citizens Association. And Ed was one of the three African-American presidents of the Chevy Chase Citizens Association so far since that period. So thank you for your service, Ed. And thank you, Sarah, for this wonderful presentation.
And thank everyone else for participating. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to a lot of the questions. Perhaps Carl and I can talk about possibly posting some of this on each of our groups. Chevy Chase Citizens Association and Historic Chevy Chase DC have websites. So perhaps we can figure out some way to answer some of these questions, or at least post some links to some of these resources that we've been talking about tonight. But we did agree that this program would be about an hour, which we now have reached. So I think we will adjourn now, but we thank everyone for tuning in. We had about, I think, 50 or more people watching this, and I hope we've given you a lot of good information. As one of our viewers just put in the chat function, I'm so glad to know the truth, even if it's not pretty. So that's one theme of what we've been talking about tonight. So thank you everyone for taking part.
Thank you.
Thank you.